Picture this. The sun is just starting to rise over the Danube, but there's no birdsong, no wind in the trees, only one sound. A rhythmic, wet thud, over and over. You're kneeling in the dirt, completely naked. Your hands are tied behind your back. Your skin is cold from the morning air, but your mind is even colder because you already know what's coming. Ahead of you stretches a line of men, 3,000 prisoners, many of them the finest nobility France ever produced. Knights, counts, lords, men who once thought they were untouchable. And sitting on a hill nearby, only a few yards away, is Sultan Bayezid I. He isn't shouting commands. He isn't pacing. He isn't even angry in the way you'd expect. He's drinking wine and watching. He has ordered every prisoner executed. Not some, not a few, every single one. And it's happening with the clean, relentless efficiency of a slaughterhouse. The scene becomes so horrifying that the executioners don't stop out of mercy. They stop because their bodies literally can't keep going. You watch one massive Ottoman soldier, his arms and shoulders drenched in blood, drop his sword like it weighs 1,000 pounds. He's gasping, his muscles twitching, his hands cramped shut from the sheer effort of cutting down hundreds of men. He stumbles back, drinks water, and passes the blade to a fresh executioner who steps forward to keep the line moving. This isn't war. This is disposal. This is the morning after the Battle of Nicopolis, September 26, 1396. And in just a few hours, the Ottoman Empire hasn't simply defeated the last great Crusader army of Europe. They have physically dismantled the age of chivalry. So how did it happen? How did 20,000 Ottomans trap, crush, and annihilate a force that the West believed could hold up the sky with their lances? Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and comment below where you're listening from. Because honestly, I still find it incredible that we're sitting here, centuries later, scattered across the globe, connected by the same curiosity about the past. Now, to understand why those men were kneeling naked in the dirt, we have to start with the glittering lie that brought them there. This crusade was supposed to be unstoppable. It was supposed to be the Golden Army. When they left Dijon and Paris months earlier, it didn't look like a military force. It looked like a traveling festival. The Duke of Burgundy had spent a fortune dressing his knights like living monuments. Velvets, silks, gold-trimmed armor engraved with religious symbols, everything polished, everything theatrical. They brought wagon loads of wine, personal chefs, pastry makers, falconers, even pleasure workers. They treated the march east, not as a campaign against a lethal superpower, but like a glamorous hunting trip, where the prey just happened to be human. These men were the superstars of the 14th century. They were convinced heavy armor and noble blood made them invincible. They believed war was a stage for individual heroism, about who could charge farthest, strike hardest, and earn the most glory. And when they looked at the Ottoman Turks, they didn't see a disciplined military empire. They saw barbarians, a rabble, a nuisance. They were wrong, dead wrong. Because while these French knights were polishing gilded armor and gambling at campfires, the Ottoman Empire was perfecting the art of destruction. This was a new kind of enemy, centralized, disciplined, ruthless. The Ottomans didn't care about honor the way the French understood it. They cared about winning. And Nicopolis wasn't just a clash of religions. It was a collision between two eras. The medieval obsession with personal glory was about to be crushed by the modern mindset of professional warfare. And the tragedy is, the Crusaders were warned. King Sigismund of Hungary, the man who called for this crusade, knew exactly what kind of enemy Bayezid was. He knew the terrain, he knew Ottoman tactics, and he begged the French nobles to be cautious, use scouts, move slowly, respect Ottoman mobility. But to the French nobility, Sigismund was boring. His caution smelled like cowardice. They mocked him, they ignored him, and their arrogance became the architect of their annihilation. Worse, the road to that bloody hill in Nicopolis was paved with atrocities committed by the Crusaders themselves. As they marched through the Balkans, this Golden Army didn't just fight the Ottomans. They pillaged their own allies. They sacked villages, stole livestock, abused peasants. They treated Orthodox Christians like second-class humans, barely better than Muslims. And the defining moment of that moral collapse came at a small fortress town called Rahova. Rahova was held by an Ottoman garrison, but it was full of Bulgarians too. When the Crusaders arrived, they saw glory. The French knights, eager to blood their swords, launched an assault. The Ottoman governor knew he was outnumbered, so he did what was normal in medieval warfare. He negotiated surrender. He agreed to open the gates in exchange for safe passage for his men and safety for the town. By the rules of war, by the codes of chivalry these knights claimed to worship, that should have ended the fighting. But the moment the gates opened, the Crusaders rushed in and slaughtered the garrison anyway. Men who had surrendered in good faith were massacred. And then the Crusaders turned on the town itself. Rahova was sacked with a ferocity that shocked even veterans of the 100 Years' War. Looting, violence, no restraint. And most importantly, the news traveled. Survivors and spies carried the story south, straight into the ears of Sultan Bayezid. And if Bayezid had any hesitation about how he would treat these invaders, Rahova erased it. In the medieval world, mercy was a transaction. You gave it to get it back. By slaughtering a surrendered garrison, the Crusaders tore up the contract of war. They signaled to the Sultan, "This is extermination." So Bayezid decided, extermination it would be. The French celebrated Rahova like a triumph. They drank imported Burgundy wine in the smoking ruins, laughing, convinced they were teaching the infidel a lesson. They didn't realize they had just signed their own death warrants. High on victory, the army pushed toward its main objective, Nicopolis, the city of victory. A fortress perched on a high bluff, heavily fortified, controlling the lower Danube. If the Crusaders captured it, they could break Ottoman control in the Balkans. They arrived in mid-September, expecting the city to fall like Rahova. But Nicopolis was different. It was commanded by Doğan Bey, a veteran Ottoman commander fiercely loyal to Bayezid. And unlike the Crusaders, Doğan Bey was prepared. He stocked food, reinforced walls, prepared his men for a siege. The Crusaders rode up to the city walls, taunting the defenders, expecting fear. Instead, they were met with silence and disciplined archery. And then the Golden Army hit its first real obstacle. They had forgotten siege engines, no trebuchets, no heavy catapults, because in their arrogance, they assumed the Turks would run away. Now the most expensive cavalry force on earth stood outside stone walls they couldn't charge, so they decided to starve the city out. But a siege is boring work. It requires trenches, watch rotations, latrines, discipline. The French knights had no interest in any of that. They built a luxurious camp outside bow range and turned the siege into a party. Banquets that lasted all night, silk tents, roasted meats, silver goblets. Jean de Nevers, son of the Duke of Burgundy, held court like he was already a conqueror. His spies told him Bayezid was weeks away, probably running, maybe fleeing to Egypt. So the knights relaxed. They didn't post proper sentries. They didn't scout far enough out. They believed their own propaganda. Inside Nicopolis, Doğan Bey watched the smoke of their feasts rise into the sky, and he smiled. Because he knew his sultan. He knew Bayezid wasn't fleeing. He knew the Thunderbolt was coming, and every night he sent runners slipping through Crusader lines with one message: "Hold on, I am coming." The Crusaders celebrated a victory they hadn't won. While just beyond the horizon, real war was marching toward them at a pace they couldn't even comprehend. The evening of September 24th, 1396, the Crusader camp outside Nicopolis looked almost peaceful. Not because things were going well. The siege had stalled. The city still hadn't fallen. The walls still held. But in the French camp, nobody acted like that mattered. They sat down to dinner, laughing, drinking, tearing into roasted meat while servants refilled their goblets. To them, this was just a waiting game, a formality. The Turks would break eventually. And Bayezid? Bayezid was probably fleeing. That was the joke they kept repeating, over and over. Bayezid the coward, Bayezid the runaway, Bayezid sprinting to Egypt to hide in the sand. And whenever anyone tried to suggest the Ottomans might actually be nearby, they were treated like they were spreading a ghost story. Some foraging parties had reported seeing strange riders in the distance, Ottoman scouts, shadowy cavalry silhouettes. But the Marshal of France, Jean Lemagne, better known as Boucicaut, was furious. He threatened to cut off the ears of anyone repeating such lies, because in his mind, nothing was more dangerous than doubt. They didn't realize the real danger was arrogance. Then, just before sunset, a scout burst into camp. Not a rumor, not a guess. A Hungarian rider, breathless, dust-covered, terrified. He didn't bring speculation, he brought coordinates. The Ottoman army was not weeks away. They were not fleeing. They were 6 hours away. 6 hours. Bayezid's army was marching down the main road, and they would be here before dawn. At first, the French nobles reacted the only way pride knows how to react: denial. They accused the scout of being a traitor, a spy sent to create panic. They were so intoxicated by their own myth that reality sounded like sabotage. But then Jean de Nevers stood up from his dinner. And in that moment, even he understood. The wine was abandoned. The laughter died instantly. The Golden Army didn't transition into order. It collapsed into chaos. Knights stumbled through camp half-drunk, screaming for squires, scrambling to find armor, trying to locate horses, shouting orders over one another. And then they saw it. Bayezid didn't hide his arrival. He wanted them to know he was there. As darkness fell, the hills surrounding Nicopolis began to glow. Thousands of campfires, flickering like a ring of predators' eyes. Fire after fire after fire, stretching across the horizon until the night itself seemed to burn. In an instant, the Crusaders realized the truth. They were no longer the besiegers. They were the besieged. The speed of Bayezid's arrival was physically impossible by European standards. He had marched his army from the siege of Constantinople to Nicopolis, over 200 miles of rough terrain in record time. He moved infantry as fast as cavalry. He dragged supplies through mountains without slowing down. The Thunderbolt had struck, and the Crusaders were still wiping dinner grease from their chins. Inside the fortress walls, the mood was completely different. Doğan Bey's men, who had been bracing for starvation and death, heard the Ottoman war drums echoing in the darkness. They lit torches on the battlements. They cheered, and the Crusaders, camped between the city and the hills, now heard something terrifying. The Ottoman army chanting Allahu Akbar from above, answered by the fortress garrison screaming back in celebration, a stereo chorus of conquest. That night, the geography of the battlefield became clear, and it was a trap. Behind the Crusaders, the Danube River, wide, cold, uncrossable. In front of them, the Ottoman army, occupying high ground and strategic plateaus. There was no retreat, no maneuvering, no escape route. The strategic victory had already been won before a single arrow was fired. Yet even then, French arrogance didn't die. It mutated. It became competitive machismo. As the leaders gathered for the war council, the question wasn't, how do we survive? It was, who gets to kill the Sultan? The hunter had arrived. The prey was arguing about who had the shinier spurs. The sun rose on September 25th, 1396, and it illuminated a war council tearing itself apart. Inside King Sigismund's tent, the air was thick with sweat and tension. On one side, Sigismund and his Hungarian commanders, men who had spent their entire lives fighting the Ottomans. On the other, the French nobility, glittering in armor, practically vibrating with impatience. Sigismund opened with a plan that was tactically perfect. He laid out the battlefield like a chessboard. He explained exactly how Bayezid fought. The Sultan, he warned, always placed his worst troops in front, the Akinci, irregular light cavalry and infantry, poorly armored, fast, disposable. Their job was not to win. Their job was to harass, exhaust, and lure the enemy into disorder. Behind the Akinci would be sharpened stakes, hidden defenses designed to break a cavalry charge. And only behind those stakes would be the real killing machine: Janissaries and Sipahis. Sigismund's plan was simple. Let my Hungarians go first. He wanted his light troops to clear the Akinci and dismantle the stakes. Then, when the Ottoman traps were exposed, the French knights could launch their glorious charge and smash the real center. Right tool for the right job. Heavy cavalry saved for the decisive moment. It was logical, sensible, smart. And to the French, it was an insult. Because medieval knights didn't view war as strategy. They viewed it as sport. Honor was the scoreboard. And allowing the Hungarians, whom they considered rustic, semi-civilized peasants, to strike first was unacceptable. That would mean the Hungarians took the first honors. That would mean the French were following, not leading. Jean de Nevers looked uncertain. His wiser advisors, like Enguerrand de Coucy, leaned toward Sigismund's plan. But then Philippe of Artois, Constable of France, stepped forward, and he was pure arrogance in human form. He shouted that Sigismund wanted to cheat them of glory. He declared the French army was the vanguard of Christendom, and that taking the rear would stain their honor forever. "We will not bring up the rear," he roared. "We will take the front, as is our right." Sigismund tried again. He pleaded. He reportedly said, "If you do this, we will lose the day." But now the council was no longer about strategy. It was about pride. To agree with Sigismund would mean admitting fear, and in this culture, being called a coward was worse than death. The constable accused anyone who wanted caution of cowardice, and that was the magic word. The rational voices fell silent. They faced a choice: suicidal charge or social disgrace. They chose suicide. The council dissolved into shouting. The French knights stormed out, calling for squires, demanding horses. They didn't coordinate with Sigismund. They didn't wait for support. They formed their own line, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 men, and prepared to attack the entire Ottoman army by themselves. Sigismund watched them march away. He'd built the coalition, raised the money, summoned Europe, and now he was watching the spearhead detach and aim directly at a cliff. He ordered his own troops to form behind them, hoping, maybe, he could salvage the disaster. But deep down, he already knew. The French weren't launching an attack. They were launching an ego trip. And here's the tragedy. If you were standing there as an observer, you would have bet on the French. They looked unstoppable. Thousands of knights in full plate armor, mounted on massive war horses, banners snapping in the wind, gold and steel flashing under the sun. It was the most powerful kinetic weapon the Middle Ages ever produced. When they lowered their lances and began to trot, the ground trembled. Trot became canter. Canter became gallop. A thunderous wave of armored cavalry charging straight toward the Ottoman line. They saw the Ottoman skirmishers in front of them, the Akinci, and smiled. They were going to crush them, and they did. The first impact was devastating. The French charge hit the Ottoman vanguard like a tidal wave crashing into a sandcastle. The Akinci were light irregulars, unarmored, armed mostly with bows and swords. They couldn't stop the momentum of full European heavy cavalry. Lances shattered shields, bodies collapsed, horses trampled men into the dust. Inside their helmets, the French knights screamed in triumph. They felt validated. Sigismund had been wrong. The Turks were weak. The battle was already half won. But they didn't understand Bayezid's army. The Akinci weren't there to stop them. They were there to absorb them. Human ammunition, expendable fuel. And when the Akinci broke and fled, it wasn't panic. It was a calculated retreat. They pulled the French deeper into the valley, farther away from Hungarian support, and straight toward the real trap. The dust cleared, and the French saw their next target. Janissaries positioned on the slope of the hill. Archers, infantry. The knights roared and spurred forward, expecting the same easy slaughter. Then the horses stopped. Screams, animal screams, filled the air, because the front line had slammed into a wall of wood. Hidden in the tall grass and dust were thousands of sharpened stakes, angled upward like teeth. Chevaux de frise, a simple defense, and a devastating one. A horse will not charge into spikes. Momentum died instantly. The charge became a traffic jam, and now the trap closed. From behind the stakes, the Janissary archers opened fire. Not scattered volleys, a storm. Composite bows powerful enough to punch into gaps in armor. But the real targets were the horses. Mount after mount turned into a pincushion, collapsing in agony. This was the moment where disciplined leadership could have saved them. Pull back, regroup, wait for infantry, clear the stakes. But the French did not retreat. They were the Golden Army. They were not supposed to retreat. Instead, they dismounted. Thousands of men in 60 to 80 pounds of armor slid off dying horses into mud. They drew swords and axes and began hacking at the wooden stakes under a rain of arrows. They were no longer cavalry. They were now the heaviest, slowest, most exhausted infantry on earth. But they kept pushing. Because arrogant or not, French knights were deadly. Even on foot, they were tanks. They chopped through the stakes. They climbed the slope. They slammed into the Janissaries. And for a moment, they started winning the brawl, steel cleaving through leather and flesh. Janissaries forced back, French knights roaring in fury, but every step up that hill was a victory for Bayezid. Because of one thing: the heat. Late September in Bulgaria, sun beating down. Inside a sealed suit of plate armor, the temperature could rise over 120 degrees Fahrenheit during exertion. The knights were cooking themselves alive. Breathing became desperate. Sweat blinded them. Muscles burned. They weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting biology. Finally, after an agonizing climb, they reached the plateau. The Janissaries fell back. The French, heaving, blood-soaked, exhausted, looked around. It seemed empty. Jean de Nevers must have felt triumph. They had done it. They had crushed the skirmishers, broken the stakes, pushed back the elite infantry. They had proven Sigismund wrong. And then, the ground began to shake again. Not from French horses, from the other side of the ridge. A deep, rhythmic tremor. 40,000 hooves. The French knights looked up, and their blood ran cold. Because Bayezid hadn't even played his hand yet. Rising over the crest like a silver tide came the Sipahis, Ottoman heavy cavalry reserves, fresh, mounted, fast, tens of thousands strong. The French were on foot, exhausted, isolated, alone. The hunt was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The collision between the fresh Ottoman Sipahis and the exhausted, dismounted French knights wasn't really a battle. It was a physics experiment gone wrong. Imagine trying to stop a speeding truck with your bare hands while wearing a sauna suit. That's what it felt like on the plateau at Nicopolis. The Sipahis swept in like a storm, riding around the flanks, scimitars flashing in the sunlight. The French knights, too tired to lift their shields, clustered together in desperate knots of steel. The famous Furia Francesca, the French Fury, evaporated instantly. Because this wasn't a duel. It wasn't heroic combat. It wasn't even controlled violence. It was herding. The Ottomans didn't need to kill every knight. They simply needed to knock them down. And once a man in full plate armor is pushed into mud, dehydrated and exhausted, he becomes a turtle on its back. He isn't getting up. The slaughter became mechanical. At the center of that chaos was Jean de Nevers, the young leader of the Crusade. Only minutes earlier, he'd believed he was winning. Now he watched his friends die in front of him. His bodyguards fought like lions, trying to keep the Sipahis away, but the weight of numbers was overwhelming. And then the Ottomans realized something important. These men weren't just soldiers. They were walking treasure chests. The order was shouted across the battlefield, "Capture the rich ones," and the slaughter shifted into a violent kidnapping operation. Knights were dragged down, beaten into submission, stripped of weapons and helmets. Gilded armor, once a symbol of pride, became a beacon that screamed, "Ransom." Jean de Nevers, heir to Burgundy, was tackled, bound, and hauled away like cargo. The Golden Army had surrendered, but down in the valley, the battle wasn't completely over. King Sigismund and the Hungarian army were still advancing. Sigismund had watched the French charge up the hill and vanish into dust. He didn't know they were already crushed. He was still trying to execute his original plan, sending infantry forward to support his reckless allies. For a brief moment, the Hungarian line held. Then the trap snapped shut. Because from the hills above, riderless horses began stampeding back down into the valley. To soldiers, this wasn't just a bad sign. It was the universal symbol of catastrophe. If the horses were returning without riders, then the French were dead. Panic spreads faster than fire. Prince Mircea of Wallachia saw the stampede, saw the Ottoman cavalry wings beginning to fold inward. and made a cold decision. He wasn't dying for French arrogance. His Wallachian cavalry turned around and rode away. They deserted the field. Sigismund was left alone. He looked up at the plateau and saw Sipahis cresting the ridge, dark silhouettes pouring down like a landslide. The Fox of Hungary understood immediately. The game was over. There was no honor in staying to be butchered. He had warned them. He had begged them. Now he had to leave them. His personal guard rushed him to the river. A boat was waiting on the Danube, and as it pushed off from the bank, rowers straining against the current, Sigismund looked back at the shore. The screams of dying crusaders carried over the water. The banner of the Virgin Mary lay trampled in the mud, replaced by horsetail standards of the Sultan. Sigismund reportedly spat into the river and muttered the epitaph of the Crusade. "We lost the day by the pride and vanity of these French. If they had believed me, we had strength enough to fight our enemies." Back on the battlefield, the fighting slowed, then stopped. The dust settled over thousands of corpses, and the surviving French knights, now stripped of helmets, tied at the wrists, were marched past piles of their own dead comrades. They were no longer the masters of Europe. They were prisoners, and as the sun began to set on September 25th, Sultan Bayezid rode onto the field to survey his victory. At first he was elated. Then he saw the dead. Not French dead, Ottoman dead, thousands of them, bodies shredded by the French initial charge. And then Rahova came back into his mind. The surrendered garrison butchered after promising safety. The town pillaged like it meant nothing. Bayezid's face hardened. The adrenaline of victory turned into something colder: vengeance. He turned to his commanders and gave an order that would turn Nicopolis from a defeat into a legend of horror. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will show them what war really is." We return now to the red morning of September 26th. The dust has settled. The battle frenzy is gone, and what remains is the cold, metallic taste of terror. Bayezid sits on a folding chair placed on high ground overlooking the river. He is bruised, he is grieving, and he is furious. He has decided that the rules of chivalry, the polite fiction that war is a game between gentlemen, do not apply here. He's going to make a statement Europe will never forget. The surviving Crusaders, roughly 3,000 men, are herded before him. They are stripped to their undergarments, or completely naked. They shiver in the morning air, but not all of them will die. Bayezid needs money, and he knows French nobility are gold mines. So he orders his men to find someone who speaks their language, someone who can separate the wheat from the chaff. They drag forward a knight named Jacques de Helly. Imagine being Jacques de Helly. You're shoved in front of the Sultan, and you're given a nightmare task. Walk the line of your bound friends and point out who's rich enough to live. So he does it. He identifies Jean de Nevers, the Count of La Marche, Marshal Boucicaut, a handful of other high-ranking nobles. They're pulled out of the line and forced to sit near the Sultan, spared. But here comes the cruel twist. Bayezid makes them watch. Then the signal is given. The rest of the prisoners, knights, squires, archers, men who marched thousands of miles for glory, are brought forward in groups. They're tied together by ropes around their necks. There is no trial, no last rites, no mercy. Only the rhythmic swing of swords. The Ottoman executioners work like machines. They sever heads until their arms cramp. Then they swap with fresh men. The soil of the Balkans, already rich, drinks deep of French blood. For the nobles spared near the Sultan, this was torture worse than death. They sat helpless as men they'd grown up with, men they'd feasted with 2 nights ago, were butchered in front of them. Some prisoners screamed toward Jean de Nevers, begging him to ransom them, to do something, anything. But he had no voice. He could only stare as the mound of severed heads grew larger and larger. Chroniclers said blood ran downhill like sudden rain, staining boots and turning the ground into sludge. The killing continued from early morning until late afternoon, a bureaucratic extermination. The only pause came when Bayezid's advisors approached him, either out of moral concern or simple practicality. They argued too much blood might offend God, or more likely, that they were wasting thousands of potential slaves. Bayezid, his rage finally cooled by the ocean of death, raised his hand. The swords stopped. The remaining survivors, mostly boys under 20, were spared, but not out of mercy. They were rounded up and marched east. Many would be forcibly converted and drafted into the very system that crushed their fathers, the next generation of Janissaries. As the sun set, the Golden Army was no more. The finest chivalry of France was either dead, headless in ditches, or shackled in chains, beginning the long, humiliating walk to Anatolia. Jean de Nevers, who wanted to be a hero, was now a trophy. He would eventually be ransomed, 200,000 gold florins, but he would return to France broken, forever haunted by the sound of steel striking flesh again and again. The shockwave traveled west fast. When the first rumors reached Paris, no one believed them. Some threatened to throw the messenger into the Seine for spreading lies. How could the invincible French knights be annihilated? Impossible. But weeks passed, then months, and tattered survivors began to appear, skeletal, hollow-eyed, traumatized. The silence that followed was worse than screaming. The French court entered mourning. The Golden Army that left in glitter returned as ghosts. It said the king ordered no one speak of the battle in his presence because the grief was too heavy. Christmas of 1396 wasn't a celebration. It was a funeral. Because Nicopolis wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological turning point for Western civilization. It effectively ended the Crusades as a unified European movement. Never again would Christendom unite in such numbers to march east. The dream of reclaiming Jerusalem was dead, buried in the mud of the Danube alongside the flower of French nobility. Europe turned inward, paralyzed by the realization they were no longer the apex predators of the world. They had met a superior military machine, and they had been found wanting. For the Ottoman Empire, Nicopolis was ascension. Bayezid proved his empire wasn't a fleeting tribal confederation. It was a permanent superpower. The Balkans were firmly under Ottoman control, and the noose around Constantinople tightened. The only reason the city didn't fall immediately after Nicopolis was fate from the east. A few years later, Timur the Lame, Tamerlane, would invade Anatolia and defeat Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara. In a brutal irony, the Thunderbolt who crushed the knights of Europe would end his days imprisoned by another conqueror. But that reprieve was temporary. The lesson of Nicopolis was already written in blood. The age of the individual hero was over. The future belonged to discipline, logistics, standing armies like the Janissaries that fought as one organism. The gun and the disciplined infantrymen were rising, and the knight in shining armor had begun his long ride into the sunset. When we look back at Nicopolis today, it's a brutal reminder of the cost of hubris. The French knights had everything: money, armor, skill, numbers, but they lacked the one thing that matters most in war and in life: humility. They refused to listen. They refused to respect their enemy. They believed their own hype. And because of that, thousands of men paid the ultimate price. History is often written by the victors, but the ghosts of Nicopolis still whisper through the chronicles. A warning: arrogance is the most dangerous armor of all. It blinds you to danger. It deafens you to reason. And in the end, it offers no protection against the sword of reality. If you found this deep dive into the end of the Crusades fascinating, you're going to want to see what happens next in the story of Ottoman rise. Because the fall of Constantinople is coming, and that story is even more dramatic. Make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on so you don't miss that documentary when it drops. And I want to hear from you. Do you think the outcome would have been different if the French listened to Sigismund? Or was the Ottoman military machine simply too advanced for medieval knights to handle? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching. And remember, history isn't just about the past. It's a warning for the future.